A man from Australia named Mitch Kuhn was traveling down the Hume Highway in Australia on the evening of April 18th, 2021. At approximately 7:40 p.m., he was on his way home to Gold Coast City after a racing event when he suddenly noticed a small figure standing in the center of the road. The guy appeared to be attempting to cross the roadway for the brief moments that he was visible, and he was wearing a blue Parker. Mitch was now traveling at about 60 miles per hour, or 96 kilometers per hour. In addition, he had a big toy transporter towed behind his vehicle. In these circumstances, attempting to brake or abruptly move off the road would have undoubtedly led to a catastrophic disaster. Mitch was forced to continue driving as a result. Luckily, he was only a few inches away from the enigmatic figure. Nearly a second later, his mother, who was also with him at the time, called the Australian police out of concern for the safety of a possible youngster walking the Hume Highway. They were informed by the officers on the internet that patrols would be deployed right away, but Mitch couldn't get what he saw out of his head. At 8:29 p.m., after exhausting all other options, he called the police once more and provided the dashcam footage he had taken of this individual. To Mitch's amazement, however, the officers informed him that they had searched the area and had really located a young child who fit the description he had given, and that he was being taken back to his house at the moment. At least he was secure now, even though it was still unclear why a toddler was on a highway at night, miles from the closest civilization. All of this made me feel incredibly ill, as Mitch wrote on Facebook later that evening. When I was informed that the child had been picked up, I immediately felt so much better. But things took a crazy turn right when Mitch believed everything was going well. Mitch posted the dashcam footage online after making sure the child was okay in the hopes that others would see the unsettling experience he experienced. In stark contrast to what they had told Mitch that evening, the New South Wales Police Department came forward and declared that they had not discovered any children on the roadway that night when the video on his tail gained popularity. The official report states that they searched the region for about 8 hours, until 3:45 a.m., when they decided to call it off, because they could not detect any signs of a youngster nearby. According to the agency, several vehicles arrived and started searching the area, but the hunt was over because no youngster could be found. There is no reason to think that the NSW police would fabricate such an official report. It is more possible that the individual who spoke with Mitch earlier made stuff up and didn't fully understand the situation. Perhaps it was just a horrible example of miscommunication, where the police who were looking for the boy somehow ended up finding him previously. However, what would happen to the youngster if he were never located? However, there are a lot of possible answers to that question. Perhaps the child's parents took him home after realizing he was missing, or he might have been abducted by someone who seized the chance after spotting a child wandering the highway by themselves at night. However, none of those hypotheses account for how the infant ended up there in the first place. Regretfully, the case is still an open mystery today. Furthermore, we're unlikely to receive answers anytime soon, given the scant coverage. Around 2:30 a.m. on May 8th, 2021, TikTokapist Pasta, whose actual name is Molly Peralz, was coming home following a night out with her friends and roommates. But what was meant to be a pleasant get-together took a sinister turn when one of them noticed a shadowy figure creeping along the Packer Drive, Northeast Road beside the Rogue River in Belmont, Michigan. What? Give up. I'm not. No. Absolutely not. Dude, what the underscore? They were drenched. Following some discussion, the group made the decision to go back and find out what it was. This is what they discovered. She's there. She's there. That was it, bro. What's to see? That was Italiano. She is in tears. A young woman, perhaps in her 20s or 30s, was seen sitting on the road and either hitting her head or waving at the passing car. Additionally, the weather was 48F, or roughly 9C, and she was soaked from head to toe. Mal's squad went around again to make sure they saw what they had seen. The woman had entirely fallen onto the road this time. Mal and her companions had concluded that this woman was probably in severe need of medical attention by this time. However, it was also possible that this was a pretext for a heist. They wisely decided to call 911 without getting out of their vehicle. She was taken to a neighboring hospital by the police and emergency responders who arrived shortly after. A few hours later, Mal went back to where they had discovered her, and the area was still damp from the water seeping from her clothing. More significantly, she discovered dig marks along the river on the side of the road, indicating that a few minutes before Mal's group came by, the woman had probably fallen in and swum out into the road. Following some research, the cops also discovered a vehicle parked close to the river, behind a house. To put it another way, she probably fell into the east bank of the river and swam all the way over to the other bank. When I asked about her on the neighborhood's Facebook page, I learned that she had, in fact, spoken to a few of the locals earlier that day, though her encounters were, to put it mildly, unsettling. I saw this individual at approximately 10:15 p.m. on Friday, between Banam and Paca Woods. When asked if she needed assistance, she said, no. One more quotation. On the Westsider's uniforms page, a man on Douglas Street had a similar experience this week when a woman entered his house. She said, hello, hello, hello. She entered someone's home and then simply walked out. She was also exploring the backyard. However, it is still unknown who she was and how she got there. She recovered sufficiently over the course of the following few days to identify herself to police as being from Kalamazoo, a town more than 60 miles from the scene of her discovery. However, she had no recollection of ever driving to Belmont, which may seem odd at first, but it actually makes a lot of sense. You see, on May 6th, 2 days before her discovery in Belmont, this woman, a 28-year-old Chinese student, vanished from Kalamazoo. She also admitted to her friends that she thought she had a stalker before she vanished. One of the first hypotheses that springs to mind when you hear this is that this stalker may have abducted her before throwing her into the river. It's crucial to remember, though, that the few witnesses in the police inquiry said she drove herself to Belmont. Whether this stalker was real is unknown, but the stress of feeling like she was being watched all the time probably affected her mental health and caused a dissociative fugue state, which is a mental illness in which a person forgets who they are and frequently begins acting in ways they would unnormally before they lose their minds and wake up. Some even go so far as to relocate to different cities and start over. The fact that the patient typically has no memory of their actions during that fugue state only serves to exacerbate an already unnerving situation, and may most likely experience that. After experiencing stress and going into a fugue state, she spent a few days driving around before ending up in the river. Thankfully, she managed to regain consciousness and swim to the coast before she perished. Following a fun-filled evening of laughter at the Drawbridge pub on October 12, 2016, a family in Sheffield, England, made the decision to return home at around midnight. They were already alert for any thieves or other crooks they could encounter on their way back because the roads in that area are typically empty at that hour. But 5 minutes later, they discovered something that nothing in the world could have predicted. A man in a clown costume emerged from the darkness and blocked the road just seconds after they turned the curve onto Grange Mill Lane Road, forcing the driver to stop. Then he began to wave at the vehicle, and as soon as it stopped completely, he began to run in its direction while continuing to obstruct the way. The clown began running at full speed when the driver attempted to turn around and drive in the opposite direction. Normally, anything like this may be written off as a YouTuber or a troll scaring people at night with a clown video, especially since it was from 2016. However, the driver of this vehicle was forced to presume the worst because of an occurrence that had only occurred 3 days prior. You see, a knife-wielding criminal attacked Simon Chinney in public on October 9th at approximately 8:45 p.m. Thankfully, the perpetrator was caught before he could cause Simon any serious harm. Unfortunately, Simon's right hand nonetheless sustained many slashes, leaving it irreversibly deformed to the extent that it is now considered disabled. The fact that it went viral and sparked a frenzy of thousands of people attempting to mimic the perpetrator was worse than the actual attack. Up to 23 reports of people threatening were being sent to police agencies in various parts of the nation. Every day, others donned clown costumes. Furthermore, some of these copycats went too far. Even though the majority were merely trolls with no genuine desire to hurt other people, some have been using knives to chase ladies and children and trying to break into people's cars. It must have been really unsettling for this driver to witness a man in a clown suit obstructing their vehicle during all of this. When they attempted to escape the clown, It began chasing them like a crazy person, which made their dread much worse. With the car swerving out of the way at the last second, the driver had no choice except to put the pedal to the metal and hope for the best. If the clown had been even a split second slower to jump away, the whole thing might have ended just as easily with his death. However, if the motorist hadn't driven away, who knows what the assailant may have done. One of the officers of the Fowler Police Department in Texas was heading back to the station after work on June 2nd, 2018, when he noticed the car in front of him abruptly veer into the next lane to avoid colliding with an object. However, this was neither an animal nor a tree branch. On the contrary, it appeared to be the aftermath of an accident or a horrifying crime. Across the street, a young woman wearing a blue shirt was lying horizontally and appeared to be either dead or unconscious, because she was so motionless. Perhaps after perpetrating the crime, someone chose to dispose of the body in the middle of the road. Thankfully, she not only answered the officer when he approached her, but she also got to her feet by herself. It turned out that she had only a few minutes before she crashed her vehicle into the ditch along the road. A very high blood alcohol content was also found in her system by further testing. Simply put, she crashed into the side while driving while intoxicated. She acted quite erratically due to the concussion from the collision and her previous drinking, which is why she approached the road and lay down carelessly. The fact that the car in front of the officer saw her and managed to avoid her in time is nothing short of a miracle, as she would have been reduced to a cautionary story about driving while intoxicated. After seeing a movie together, 25-year-old Jimmy Hollis and his Mary Gia were heading back to their houses in Texarkana, Texas, on the evening of February 26th, 1946. However, Jimmy pulled over on the side of the road to prolong their date for a little bit before they arrived at the city boundaries. But neither of them realized that this small diversion would almost result in their deaths. A man approached the automobile after emerging from the surrounding bushes. Approximately 10 minutes after they had stopped, over his head had a white pillowcase with 2 tiny eye slits in it. The remainder of his face was entirely obscured. At first, Jimmy didn't pay much heed to his order to exit the car, since he thought it was some kind of practical joke. "I don't want to kill you, fella," the masked man said as he produced his gun and aimed it at the couple. "Just follow my instructions." Jimmy complied with the masked man's instructions to exit the automobile, realizing the seriousness of the situation. The attacker immediately struck Jimmy's skull with his weapon, rendering him unconscious. When Mary attempted to flee into the woods, the man caught up with her and did the same to her. Fortunately, he was startled by a set of headlights arriving on the adjoining road and fled before he could go any farther. Mary hurried to the closest residence right away and requested that they contact the police. Jimmy also recovered consciousness and called for assistance from a passing vehicle, but the man had disappeared completely by the time the cops showed up to conduct an investigation. After Jimmy and Marie were brought to the hospital, it was found that Jimmy suffered many fractures to his skull from the impact. Thankfully, he recovered without suffering any long-term wounds and shared his memories of the evening. He and Mary both described the masked man as general appearance as being around 6 feet tall and somewhat slim. However, the two couldn't agree on his ethnicity for whatever reason. Mary continued to assert that Jimmy was of African descent, despite Jimmy's insistence that he was Caucasian. Because of this inconsistency and the incident's apparent lack of provocation, detectives mistakenly thought the couple knew the individual and were merely attempting to shield him. They were unaware that the next pair would not be as lucky as Jimmy and Mary, who lived long enough to provide a description. A man saw a car stopped on the road ahead of him on March 24th, approximately a month later, while he was traveling down a remote road outside of Texarkana. From a distance, it appeared as though a young man was dozing off in that vehicle, leaning on the steering wheel. But as the driver approached, he had a hunch that something wasn't quite right. In an attempt to wake the other car, he pulled over to the side and approached it, only to be met with a scene that was far more horrifying than he had ever seen. In other words, long before the driver happened to cross him, the young man had already died. He also saw a woman who had tragically met the same end in the back seat. The police were summoned to the location. They recognized the two right away as Richard Griffin and Polly Ann Moore, his girlfriend. Both were shot in the head and died. Unfortunately, investigators were only able to collect one .32 caliber cartridge from the crime scene. Even though they were unaware of it at the time, the same man Jimmy and Mary had met a month prior was also responsible for this occurrence. On April 14th, when a second couple ran across the same individual on a remote road, and was slain with a gun of the same caliber. The authorities finally connected the dots. All of Texarkana's citizens were placed on high alert. As soon as word of these 3 tragedies emerged, most locals completely ceased driving at night out of fear for their safety, while those who remained took care to stay off deserted roads. Because he couldn't appear and vanish without a trace, the masked guy was also dubbed the Texarkana of Phantom, and as his name suggests, even after the FBI became involved, he was getting tougher to find every day. One of the detectives discovered, after 2 additional months of unsuccessful investigation, that the cars had been taken just before each occurrence and had been discovered abandoned shortly thereafter. A man called Ule Swinney, a car thief with 2 prior convictions, was found after following this lead. His height and physique were consistent with what Mary and Jimmy had previously said. More significantly, he stated that he was aware that the police wanted him for reasons other than car theft when he attempted to arrest him for the 3rd time for auto theft. Regretfully, detectives failed to uncover any proof that connected Ule to the 3 Erie Road encounters. Fortune. Prosecutors were able to impose the maximum penalty possible. Life in prison for his 3rd theft-related offense because of his prior offenses. The Texarkana of ghost encounters is a partly unsolved enigma to this day, since Ule insisted on denying any role in the 3 instances until he died in 1994, around 11 p.m. On January 8th, a truck driver in Western Australia was traveling on a secluded section of the highway when he had the most terrifying traffic incident of his life. South of Perth, about 62 miles, he noticed what appeared to be 2 individuals pulling something across the motorway. The truck driver had to swerve around them at a risky speed because they appeared almost out of nowhere. However, they had already disappeared into the surrounding darkness. When he pulled over and turned around, this raises the question of what they were dragging and why. Unfortunately, there is a lot of ambiguity in the answers to these 2 questions. To begin with, it's really challenging to determine exactly what they were dragging. Frame by frame, we can make out what appeared to be the legs of a different individual with black shoes and shorts. Thus, it is possible that the 2 were attempting to conceal the main proof of their heinous crime. However, when moving, it appeared more like an animal or a hybrid. Its extremely human-like proportions could be explained by the fact that it is a life-sized plush. However, the question of why 2 people would pull something across a highway is just as significant regardless of what it was. An Uber driver from New York described his harrowing encounter with an irate man on Long Island on September 16, 2018. He was just finishing a ride when a second car unexpectedly passed him at high speed, narrowly missing an accident. However, the other motorists applied the brakes and halted in the middle of the road, preventing the Uber driver from continuing until he had had time to comprehend what had happened. After instructing the Uber driver to get out, he exited the vehicle, went over, and began smashing on the glass. This is what's happening. What's happening? What is that? Your right leg was blown. Remove the underscore from the vehicle. Proceed, 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 proceed. Simply go around and around. Go, go, go. It is unclear whether this was an effort to rob the driver and his companions, or just pure road rage. The Uber driver made the right choice by backing up to find another way to his destination, because he did want to know the answer. He could not, however, have foreseen the other driver's level of persistence. The other motorist got into his car and began pursuing the Uber driver wherever he went. As soon as he changed routes, as they got closer to a red light, which would have allowed the other vehicle to catch up and do something dreadful. Before the cops arrived, things got worse. However, the Uber driver was extremely fortunate to discover a police officer waiting at the crossing. The other motorist was detained for driving while intoxicated, after they were able to explain the circumstances. The officers halted the vehicle, got out, and attempted to argue with me. I turned around and backed up. Then, as he was after me, these girls called 911, and the cop, followed him. Simply said, the other driver may have been armed and wasn't acting rationally. All 3 of them could have died if the Uber driver had gotten scared when he initially came up.